I often get asked how I paint expressive portraits, but the fact is anyone can paint a portrait if you break it down to simple steps. In this video, I'm going to show you 5 simple steps to paint any portrait from any reference. Let's go. First step is this. You need to divide your tones. Draw in such a way that you consider the tonal shapes. This happens in my drawing, and it happens in the way I prepare my paints. I've divided every color so it matches the tonal variations, and this is super helpful because every one of these tones are the only tones that I'm using when I do this painting. So that means my first step is just simply to get these dark tones on my painting. And it's quite simple really, you just, at this point, filling in the colors that you've already pre-divided. I find it's very helpful to avoid going beyond these first initial 5 or 6 tones that I prepare, because it means everything stays really consistent and really harmonious. Now it's at this point that I realized I was starting to fall into my own trap. You see, the eyes are often drawn to details, and I like working on details of eyes, but here I made a decision regarding my next step. And the next step is this. It's called massing. Massing is the process of blocking in large areas of shadow to establish the basic value and structure of a form. You see, right now I'm avoiding trying to do some of the details of the eyes and some of the details in this face, because really at this point I need to be thinking about the large masses. Where are the large areas of shadow? And then eventually I'm going to start working towards the larger areas of light. It's funny because people tend to be details focused, or they tend to be big picture focused. I don't know if you've noticed this personality type within yourself, whether you like honing in on little details or whether you like thinking large. But the reality is, when you're painting, you need to try find the balance of detail and big picture. If you hone in on a detail, then you're gonna get a bit lost and caught up in those details. What you need to do is try keep that big picture earlier on in the painting process. When you can zoom out, when you're focusing on the massing, when you're focusing on the broader shapes, then you set the scene and you set the stage for some smaller details. Now it's interesting because I'm often trying to preach this to myself. I'm about 20 years into my painting journey, but I notice how quickly I get distracted by details, and I think I'm even doing that a little bit in this painting, where I'm trying to keep focused on the broader perspective of these wider, bigger shapes. The next step for your painting process is to consider contours. Contours are the precise lines or shapes that define the edges and the planes of the subject, providing a sense of clarity and structure. So you want to find the shapes. You want to over-exaggerate the curves that create that sense of three-dimensionality to your portrait. And that helps you consider the direction of your brushstrokes. Your brushstrokes should be angled at a direction that exaggerates that sense of curvature or that sense of the shape of the plane that you are depicting. Now, in a way, I call all these steps because they're not really rules. And it's important to know when to break your own rules. At this point, I've talked about dividing your tones and then massing and I've talked about the contours, but I'm now at a point where I really want to start identifying just some of the details that I find important. Now, I'm looking at a face, right? And so much emotion is expressed in the eyes of my face. So here I'm breaking my rule. I'm actually using a smaller brush, and I'm now capturing just some of the details of the eyes. You'll notice I'm putting in the whites of the eyes, and that white is actually quite a dark grey. It's not too white. It looks pretty bright because it's against this mid-tone background, but I'm just reminding you at this point that actually the whites of the eyes are not that bright, and if they become too bright, the eyes can look just a little bit freaky, so we want to avoid that. And then, of course, I'm just putting in some of the details of the eyes. I want to put in the shadows, put in the highlights, and then, of course, put in some of the color. The color I'm capturing, I'm not introducing a new blue pigment. I want to keep all my colors quite harmonious, and so I'm only using the pigments that I've laid out on my palette. It's a good moment to let you know why my palette happens to be that kind of paper. I use butcher's paper, not butcher's paper, sorry. I use baker's paper. Why baker's paper? Well, it has this beautiful coat of wax, and so it makes a beautiful palette, but then I can just scrunch it up and throw it away at the end. It's funny, you can spend so much time just cleaning, and sometimes you just need these hacks so that the blockage between you and painting just becomes a bit less. So that's why I use this sort of paper on my palette. Going back to what I was saying about these eyes, I work with a very simplified color palette. I only have 6 paints in this portrait, and by reducing it to 6 pigments, my colors become a lot more harmonious. They work together, and so there's no danger of adding a bit of red here or a bit of violet there, because it's actually fully integrated into every skin tone. That is, my mid-tone has yellow, it has red, both crimson and naphthol, and it also has some violet, which is why I'm using this violet and a little bit of phthalo green, which happens to be in my darker toned black. I'm using this violet and green to make the blue of the eyes. Okay, I'm entering a bit of a hush moment here because this is almost a sacred moment. The whites, the highlight in the eyes. There's something about this highlight that adds so much personality and character to my portrait. So it's really important to try to do that well. That's when the soul kind of enters the painting, I think. I love it. The next step that I consider key to a good portrait is what we call chiaroscuro. Maybe it's not so much a step as to something I've been thinking about just throughout the painting process. So what is chiaroscuro? Chiaroscuro is the contrast between light and dark. More specifically, it's when the light shines in the darkness. My platform, my foundation for this painting was to create shadows, to create dark areas from which the light marks could shine. You see, light only shines in the darkness. That's why I began this portrait with a mid-tone orange background. And it's why I focused on doing the dark shapes first. Because then it gives me a platform to add those highlights and to create chiaroscuro, which gives an illusion of volume and depth. That's something I consider in all my paintings, and it's why we've divided this image into multiple tones, because the more you create contrast, the more you have character and expression in your portrait. Here I'm adding dioxazine violet. This is one of the 6 colors that I have included throughout my palette in its purest form. So this dioxazine violet is actually integrated throughout those skin tones. And I think that's why I'm using this, because it in a way still kind of harmonizes with my portrait whilst adding a lot of vibrancy and color. And I just thought that would be really nice in the background. Now, I'm setting the stage here for the beard. This beard is an awesome, wiry beard, and I think it needs a good foundation. So this is where I'm adding my dark tones again, and really the beard is just no different to the rest of the portrait. It's just like skin. You add your darks and that gives a foundation and a framework in which you can add highlights. So that's what I'm doing. But rather than focusing on the individual strands of hair, I'm really trying to build in some of the shapes of this beard. I'm trying to kind of turn hairs into shapes in a way. Maybe that's a bit weird, but it seems to work out in a portrait if you just focus on shapes. Maybe that's a stylistic choice I'm making. I like it. It adds a bit more form and structure to the portrait. We're entering our final step of this portrait, and that final step is the details. Details matter. And I find that actually a large portion of my painting is focused on this final step, is just refining. And here you can let your intuition take over and just keep on looking and trying to figure out what's working, what isn't. Where do you need to push and pull? Where do you need to add more shadow or define more highlights? And as you do this, you will end up with something you're proud of. If you found this video helpful, you might enjoy this one. I used the same principles to create quite a different portrait. I quite like this one. I hope you do too.